Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this fourth session of the Sustainable Beef webinar series. Our last one will be June 1st. I'm very happy that you've joined us today, taking time out of your busy schedules. And I'd like to send a warm welcome to those on Facebook and on the YouTube platforms. People are monitoring the chat there and they can bring it over to Zoom where we are. So feel free to chat throughout the session. And we'll be asking the panelists to answer through. There's no real Q&A session, so people can answer throughout. It's a chat as we go along. So again, this is the fourth session. Today, the focus is more on markets. It's more on profitability. It's on finances, sustainability, economics of beef production in the Americas. And as you may recall from the previous sessions, if you haven't seen them, you can always view them on our ICA Canada page. And so we've got the three there now, and then we'll be adding one today. The start was two videos with, you have the warm words of welcome from our Deputy Director General at ICA and from IFAD, our sponsor. And so I'll ask Isabel to share those two videos right now. Thanks.
On behalf of IFAD, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this seminar on sustainable livestock. This initiative, organised by the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture and financed by the International Fund for Agriculture Development, or IFAD, also has the technical support of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef and the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. As you know, climate change will affect animal health, well-being and productivity, with resulting effects especially on pastoralists and small-scale livestock keepers. Changes in climate can lead to new animal pests or to the return of previously eradicated diseases. The secondary impacts of climate change on livestock may include, among others, increased pressure on productive pastures, water resources, and increased fodder prices, ultimately resulting in a loss of food sources, income, and livestock assets. Climate change impacts on poor and disadvantaged rural people disproportionately. Pastoralists, poor households, women, children, youth, and marginalised Indigenous groups being particularly vulnerable. In addition, poverty, lack of political power, and marginalisation from decision-making processes reduce the ability of these groups to adapt to climate change. Climate change is likely to intensify existing inequalities and have different effects on the capacity of women and men to cope with additional stress. In fact, women play a significant and active role in livestock production systems. Climate change necessitates rethinking approaches to gender inequality and to involve both women and men in finding innovative solutions. Between 2003 and 2015, IFAD invested almost $500 million to promote pastoral development. In addition, last year, IFAD launched the Adaptation for Smallholder Agriculture program, or ASSET Plus, which aims at increasing the resilience of vulnerable communities, farmers, fishers, and pastoralists. For example, in Sudan, livestock business development aims to promote access to finance for livestock owners and market development of the national livestock industry. In Lesotho, wool and mohair production is being improved on the ground with co-benefits for rangeland rehabilitation. In Kyrgyzstan, Asset Plus contributes to enhancing economic growth in pastoral communities through community-driven development approaches. Thank you in advance for your participation today. We look forward to the outcomes of today's discussion. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lloyd Day, and I'm the Deputy Director General of the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture, ICA. ICA represents the Ministers of Agriculture of the Western Hemisphere, from Canada in the north to Chile and Argentina in the south, and 14 member states in the Caribbean as well. Our mission is to promote agricultural development and rural well-being in the Americas and the Caribbean, and to serve as a bridge for this region's contribution to agricultural production and science around the world. Welcome to this webinar series from ICA Canada on sustainable beef. As someone who once led the checkoff programs at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the saying, "Beef, it's what's for dinner," is embedded in my DNA. Working on behalf of agriculture in the Americas, I can tell you that I have not only enjoyed a good steak in Ottawa, our Canadian host city, but also in many other cities and countries in the Americas where the beef sector is not just an important part of each nation's economic activity, but is ingrained in the culture, society, and history of the people. However, the sector also faces many challenges with growing anxiety about climate change and certain methods of production, as well as animal welfare. We must address these concerns to improve not just our methods of production for the sake of the environment and animals, but also show how the sector is vital for its contributions to society. Therefore, we at ICA have been working closely with myriad organizations in the livestock sector to ensure a more balanced and scientific analysis of the importance of livestock. In preparation for the UN Food Systems Summit, ICA partnered with the livestock sector in multiple different fora and publications to provide guidance and leadership from the Americas on the contributions of livestock to the human health, nutrition, the economy, and the environment. This culminated with ICA's Director General, Dr. Manuel Otero, presenting 16 key messages from the Americas to the United Nations Food Systems Summit regarding agriculture's important role in the transformation of the world's food systems based on farmers, science, and agriculture as part of the solution to our planetary challenges. We are delighted to be joining in these webinars with the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, with whom ICA formed an alliance in 2022, and the Canadian Roundtable on Sustainable Beef, our Canadian partner. Thank you to the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, for their sponsorship of these webinars and the decades of collaboration with ICA in the Americas. We are very grateful also for the time and intellectual contribution by all of our speakers during these sessions. Your contributions to these discussions will become part of the intellectual record that will help us promote our goal to provide important contributions to the policies that nations generate to help support sustainable beef production in the Americas, the Caribbean, and other regions of the world. Thank you and best wishes for a successful webinar.
Excellent. Well, our thanks to both gentlemen for those excellent remarks. I wanted to introduce now the chair of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, one of our main partners for this webinar series. She's also a beef producer and a market analyst. Over to you, Ann.
Thank you so much. Hello. Thanks again for inviting me to make opening remarks today. My name is Ann Wasco. As you've heard, I am chair of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and I am a beef producer in Western Canada. I also wear the hat as a market analyst for the Canadian beef industry. So the topic of economic sustainability in beef production hits close to home for me on many fronts. Canadian beef producers have always pushed the needle to do more with less as technologies become available. For example, over the last 30 years, to produce 1 unit of beef, the amount of land used decreased by 24%, the amount of water used decreased 17%, 29% fewer breeding cattle were needed, and the carbon footprint shrunk by 14%. The Canadian beef industry recently set a series of ambitious long-term goals for 2030 that provide clear messaging about the process to continually improve how cattle are raised and enhance the natural environments under the care of beef producers and farmers and ranchers. Producers have historically adopted and invested in practices that are economical and provide value. Ongoing production efficiencies tend to be quickly adopted when they make economic sense to the individual operations. At the end of the day, there is no downside to efficiency improvements which support climate goals and individual productivity, thereby economic viability. Canadian beef producers see climate change firsthand every day when we walk out of the house. In my part of Canada, we faced extreme drought conditions last year, and we aren't out of the woods yet this year. Temperature swings from wickedly cold to blistering hot seem all too frequent in very short time frames. Storms are more violent and cause more damage to crops, livestock, and infrastructure. We know cattle can be part of the solution to climate change. The Canadian beef sector is committed to emissions reductions and have set a goal to reduce greenhouse gas intensity by a further 33%. Some of the other goals the industry has set are sequestering an additional 3.4 million tons of carbon per year and maintaining the 34 million acres of grasslands in the care of beef producers in Canada. A recent scientific study led by Nature United assessed natural climate solutions and showed that avoided grassland conversion represents one of the largest climate change mitigation opportunities for us here in Canada. We need to collectively invest in long-term research and enable innovations that help our sector reduce its greenhouse gas footprint. Producers could also benefit from a broader move towards an adaptive agriculture system supported by a sustainable economy that provides a financial benefit or incentive for ecosystem services associated with beef production and the preservation of critical grasslands. In 2017, the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef launched the first outcome-based certification program for beef sustainability in the world. As a producer, it's always nice when the demand signal for sustainable beef comes directly from the consumer and their pocketbook. Each year, we see the demand for certified sustainable beef in Canada grow in terms of beef volume. Some end users have developed programs to directly reward the producer of these cattle in terms of a financial credit. And more broadly, I believe that maintaining and building public trust in the benefits of provided through Canadian beef production will have positive financial consequences. It's no accident that economic viability underscores all 5 principles of beef sustainability. To be clear, one doesn't happen without the other. I look forward to hearing today's panelists on this important topic. Thank you again for having me here today.
Well, thanks to you, Ann. On the contrary, what have you found to be the greatest challenge so far? If you had to pick the top 3 or just the one that is giving farmers the most difficulty?
I think the bottom line comes back to that direct incentive and linking the two. I constantly hear from my peers, where's the value? Where do I see the value in terms of doing all the right things? So that's the linkage that we need to make. We know we need to do the right things for our business in terms of economic viability, but putting that linkage towards a credit or some kind of incentive that says, okay, that's the value contribution, and I can put those 2 pieces together. I'd say that's it.
Thanks, Ann. And do you feel that the certification right now, I see a lot of growth. Is that one of those market signals that you're speaking to?
Oh, absolutely. And anytime somebody gets a check back in the mail that is associated with those cattle that were raised under the certified program, that's a clear message for sure. And we keep hearing the demand is outpacing the supply. So here we are on the ground, encouraging producers to go get that third-party audit done, go through the steps, and they're coming on stream. But anybody familiar with beef producers, often at the grassroots level, it's not a swift uptake, but they will uptake when they see that value proposition make sense.
Fantastic, Ann. Thanks. I'm going to invite the public to use the chat. Any other, and the panelists as well. If you feel you want to provide Ann with some questions, she's around and she can provide some responses in the chat directly while we listen to the other speakers. And our next speaker, thanks again. And our next speaker is in the Netherlands. He's a global strategist on animal protein at Rabobank. Over to you, Justin.
Jean-Charles, thank you very much. And Anne, thank you also for setting up the session so well with that introduction. I want to pull up some slides here. And as I'm doing that, I want to start with a point which is not necessarily disagreeing with what Anne said, but perhaps providing another way of thinking about the situation that we're in, where we're all looking for some sort of incentive or some sort of reason, something from the market, a signal that says, yes, you're on the right track. Yes, this is the right direction to go for the future. And yes, we want you to do more, and we want more of you to do the same thing. I work at a bank, and our perspective is always one of how finance helps to make things happen and helps to change things. And the point I want to get across in this session today is that really capital finance is thinking differently now about sustainability. This is no longer for maybe not today, but in the coming years in the financial markets. This is no longer, oh, okay, is there an incentive or a bonus or a premium in some way for doing sustainability? It's more a defensive approach. It's more about avoiding risk and saying, should we actually be financing those? Should we be exposing ourselves to those who cannot or do not demonstrate their sustainability credentials? There are 4 points that I want to make to you today, and I want to go through each of them in time. The first is that I think now is the time to start or to continue, depending on where you are, investing in ways that demonstrably meet beef sustainability goals and at the same time think about boosting productivity on farm. There may not be an explicit or a clear financial incentive today for the steps that you are going to take, the investments that are needed to demonstrate that you're meeting sustainability goals. So think through the opportunity to boost productivity at the same time as you're doing it. Secondly, start showing how these sorts of investments add value to the business in ways that investors can understand. I work at
Justin,
a bank and
sorry
yeah.
to interrupt. This is JC here at ICA. We're not seeing your slides transition to the next page as you speak.
Okay, right. I'm on the second slide. You can't see that though.
We only see the first one.
Okay, and this isn't changing
It's not in
things either,
presentation
Jason.
mode.
Let me see if I can bring it up again.
Yep. Okay.
And see if that helps. I'm sorry about this
No
hiccup.
worries. Excellent presentation. It's just
Well, you haven't seen it, JC.
Yeah,
You're very generous in your praise for something you haven't seen. Let's see if this is indeed on a different slide.
Okay, you're not in presentation format, but we can see the second slide.
Okay, that's curious. I don't know quite what to do about that, but let's at least
try that one. Just there.
maximize
below.
what's there. Yeah. But you don't see that in presentation
No.
mode while I do.
Okay.
Gloria, maybe it's easier if you show these slides, and so we don't impose my technical capabilities or lack thereof on the audience.
Fantastic. Well, let's ask Gloria.
Le pido por favor parar su presentación.
Need to remove your presentation.
The third point that I want to make, and let me stop sharing my screen if that hasn't happened already. The third point that I want to make is that really there is now an important step for all of us to make, which is to think about measurement, think about reporting, and think about verification of the steps we are taking to boost sustainability in the work that we are doing and along the supply chain. It's one thing to say, yes, we're doing the right thing. It's another thing to prove that, to demonstrate that, and especially to do that in ways that make sense for the audience that we're talking to. And my perspective on that is about financial markets and is about those active in financial markets. Finally, I think there is value in supporting multi-stakeholder initiatives. Anne is part of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable beef. I am an executive committee member of the Global Roundtable on Sustainable Beef. These might not be the right initiatives for you, but these are the sorts of initiatives that are both defining sustainability metrics in beef supply chains and are promoting the use of those metrics to all people along the beef supply chain. Let's look at some of the trends that are happening in financial markets to round out the points that I'm making here. If we could go to the next slide, please. The first point that I want to make here is that the way that financial markets think about this, ESG, environment, social, and governance factors, they are starting to screen all of their investments on the basis of these environment, social, and governance factors or metrics. There is more reporting by companies all along beef supply chains around their environment, social, and governance metrics. There is increasing development of financial products and services by those participating in financial markets. And the fourth point that I want to make here to back up the opening statements is that there are activists working in financial markets who look to focus on these environment, social, and governance metrics and look to enforce, encourage, suggest, imply change on those who are also acting in those markets. If we go to the next slide, please. Let me start by talking about the screening of investments. This chart here just shows a simple progression or simple growth in the assets under management that investors are screening on ESG basis. Now, those numbers, they're very large numbers, these are global numbers, but looking towards 50 trillion US dollars by 2025 will represent about 30, 35, maybe just a bit over 1/3 of total assets under management. So coming from a position just a few years ago of 15, 20%, we're now moving very quickly towards 1/3 of all assets under management. All funds which are being managed by investors are under these environment, social, and governance factors. There is a screening of what's there associated with those. This is the point about investors are more actively screening for these factors. Next slide, please. So the second point is reporting of these initiatives by companies. And let's go to the next slide straight away, please. Here, I want to share with you what we are doing at Rabobank, which is publicly reporting on our financed emissions. We are doing this as a bank. Many other banks are doing this. In fact, I read just the other day that in Canada, where our hosts today are based, there is a new law which will require all banks to report on financed emissions by 2024. This is part of various industry-wide commitments that banks sign up to, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, for example. But the growth that is happening by banks in these sorts of metrics, in these sorts of initiatives, is very rapid. Asset managers screening on ESG criteria, environmental, social, governance criteria. Banks reporting on the emissions in their supply chain, not their own emissions, not what we do as a bank. We don't do very much, move money around about the world, on the emissions associated with all of the loans in our portfolio. So in the language of emissions, this is scope 3 emissions, which we are reporting on and making commitments to reduce those scope 3 commitments. Next slide, please. Reporting is also happening inside supply chains. I give an example here of a global retailer based in the UK but acting in other places. It has started to ask its whole supply chain, starting with its direct suppliers, to provide details, to provide evidence of, first of all, what their emissions are, secondly, what goals they have to reduce emissions, and thirdly, to get those goals to reduce emissions acknowledged, accepted, endorsed by a third party, in this case, the Science Based Targets Initiative. That's happening all within the space of just a couple of years. Any company, any individual who's gone down this path of the Science Based Target Initiative knows that this is an ambitious time frame. And yet, this is not necessarily about reducing emissions from this food retailer itself. It's about how do you access that market. If you don't get onto these sorts of programs, if you are not able to demonstrate the progress that you are making, then you are not going to continue to be a part of these supply chains in the coming years. Next slide, please. There's also, of course, questions about whether the market, whether financial markets, whether companies involved in food supply chains can be trusted to actually define and measure these things. And there is still quite some evidence floating around, stories floating around on greenwashing or sustainability fraud. How do you tell if ethical conduct by a company is actually true? We should expect more focus from the media, more focus from activists, more focus from non-governmental organizations around the claims that companies are making and the veracity or the third party verification around those claims. Again, the movement here is all about how you access the market for the end product and the steps you need to take, the evidence that you need to demonstrate in that process. Next slide, please. The third point I wanted to make is that financial services companies are continuing to innovate around the products they offer so that they can help with the transition to reducing emissions. Can we go to the next slide, please? I'm wanting to show you here a little bit about what banks are doing, which is about sustainability linked loans, loans that have specific sustainability criteria embedded into the legal documentation around that loan. So this is no longer about simply lending money from a bank to somebody who's doing something. This is about adding sustainability criteria to that loan and in some cases, about providing an incentive, a difference, a differential on the interest rate for meeting those criteria that are embedded into the loan. And at the same time, providing a penalty for those who may exceed or not meet the targets, the sustainability metrics built into the loan. You see on the left hand here, you see the actual quantum of loans. How many here we're talking about US dollars here, and these are billions. So you sort of see where last year we reached almost 3 trillion US dollars of loans that contained these sustainability linked criteria. And you can see on the right hand side, if you follow the right hand axis of the left hand chart, you can see that we're reaching almost 20% of all loans that were written in 2021 that included these sustainability metrics. And I have a little bit of partial data for 2022. On the right hand side, this is simply the number of loans that we see. And here you see the count of the number of deals that were actually closed. And again, you see in terms of the share, this is getting close to about 20% of all of the loans that were written. These are wholesale market loans or corporate loans, and about 20% of them now globally have these sustainability criteria embedded in them. Next slide, please. The final point, and let's go straight on to the next slide, is a point of caution, and that is that there are also activists looking at the behavior of companies, looking at the progress that companies are making, and using stock markets, using another part of the financial services industry to try and put pressure on their behavior to influence the way that they act. This is an example of Ceres, a US-based company, a US-based NGO, which is looking at benchmark companies in the food industry and looking at the commitments that have been taken, in this case, towards sustainability, towards the Science-Based Target Initiative in particular, and more generally about their disclosure on their emissions. So let me round off there and just re-emphasize the point that access to capital, access to finance, wherever you sit in beef supply chains, is starting to be influenced, shaped by the sustainability performance of your business, of your farm, of your ranch, of your beef processing plant, of your inputs company. of your beef marketing company in food retail, food service, etc. Wherever you sit in the chain, whoever your suppliers are, whoever your customers are, financial markets are increasingly looking at this, and over the coming years, you will see much more activity in these markets. If you are not able to demonstrate sustainability performance, you may find yourself being excluded from some of these markets or penalized in the markets that you can get access to. I'm going to leave it there. Hand back to you, Anne. Thank you.
Fantastic, Justin. Thanks very much. I'm wondering if you have any insights on the decision making at the farm, at the for the beef producer. If how can he or her present or make their case in terms of their sustainable performance? What is it required to convince and to demonstrate that to investors, to banks, and their partners?
I think a very simple example there, JC, is the point that Anne made before about the launch in Canada of the goals for sustainable beef. For a rancher to simply report on what progress they are making in those goal areas that have been set. A further step that could be taken is to have some sort of third-party audit or verification of that activity. That may not be necessary at the moment, but to simply start establishing a baseline. Where do you stand today or last year, the year before? Where did you stand in all of those goal areas? It's a simple step that you will find will be asked for, many will find will be asked for in the coming years by their bank. If you're not able to demonstrate your progress against a recognized industry approach such as that, then you may find that the bank, your financier, imposes their own criteria on you. So, there's a trade-off that you have to make there between taking a proactive step and understanding where you are, or risk having another system imposed on you, which may be more difficult, less relevant to your business.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that there's a difference geographically? Are the Americas trending differently from the rest of the world?
That's an interesting question. I would actually say, in my experience, I think Brazil has been one of the most proactive countries in the world where we've seen finance used as a way to try and recognize or sustainability performance. For example, ranchers that can demonstrate that they are not using farming land which was cleared within X amount of time or has only been cleared in a legally applicable way, are given a discount on the interest rate that they are charged. So for me, Brazil has always been one of the markets which has stood out globally, not just within the Americas, as having a more proactive stance there. I would expect, though, across North America that you will start to see banks moving in the direction that I've described very quickly. I mean, the movement in this space within the financial industry is very rapid, and of course it's all about what happens in their supply chain, JC, because as organizations ourselves pushing money around about the world, looking to get that money back, we don't actually have large emissions in the same way that the beef supply chain does.
And I see you in the chat. Did you want to ask a question or add information for Justin?
Yes, I just added a link to our third-party certification program if folks want to look at what we're doing in Canada.
Fantastic.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yes, I was going to say the same thing, Justin, and invite you as well if you wanted to add any links in the chat to the resources at Rabobank or where people can get that data, global data, maybe a geographical perspective of the numbers and data sets. Please post them to the chat. I'm going to invite our next speaker, Brenna Grant, to join us. She's the Executive Director of Canfax Research Services. Fantastic group here, a strong reputation in the country, and it's part of the Accountants Association. Over to you, Brenna.
Thank you, JC. So I work in collaboration with the Canadian Roundtable of Sustainable Beef. And back in 2016, we completed the first National Beef Sustainability Assessment. And this covered an environmental assessment, a social assessment, but also an economic assessment. And that's what I want to be talking about today is how did we go about thinking about economic sustainability for the Canadian beef industry? And we defined economic sustainability as the ability of a system to maintain productivity in the face of a major disturbance, as well as slow shifts in consumer preferences. And this definition focuses on the resilience of the industry as a whole and its ability to adapt to changing market conditions. In terms of the probability to persist into some future moment in time, the best proxy that we have to evaluate that is the past. And so we relied a lot on historical evidence to evaluate how the beef industry might respond to a major disturbance, such as a disease outbreak, market shocks, weather impacts, as well as changing consumer preferences as we looked into the future. And for this, we created a framework with 4 main pillars, looking at both producer viability and consumer resilience. And recognizing that on the producer side, we need long-term profitability, as well as recognizing that cost structure is really important there. And then looking at both the domestic consumer, but also recognizing that Canada has a very large proportion of its production that's exported, also looking at that international consumer demand. And some profitability considerations that we have when it comes to the producer side of things is the fact that agricultural commodities tend to experience what we as economists call declining terms of trade. And declining terms of trade is when the price received for outputs declines relative to the price paid for inputs. And this happens when productivity improvements result in supply increasing faster than demand, leading to declining deflated commodity prices. And this can be addressed in 2 ways. First, by increasing demand for the commodity. So that's why we have the piece about consumer resilience and domestic and international demand. But any increase in demand must be greater than the increase in supply in order to result in a higher real price for the commodity being sold. And if the domestic market is saturated or mature, the next step really is to look for that global market and the international consumer. The second option is for individual producers to improve productivity, really focusing on reducing their cost of production in order to stay ahead of those declining prices. Now, the benefit is that this is an area that's within the direct influence of the producer. But the irony here is that the cause is the cure, because when you focus on reducing cost of production and improving productivity, then you're also increasing supply, pressuring your prices. And so producers' viability refers to the producer's financial ability and incentive to continue producing that product. And profitability provides the signal to producers to maintain or grow the business. But when we look at the entire supply chain from cow-calf to feedlot to the packer, it's very rare that all of the sectors are profitable at the same time. And this is partly due to the fact that when feeder prices are high, supporting cow-calf profitability, that really squeezes feedlot margins because they're the input price for them. Similarly, when fed cattle prices are high, supporting feedlot margins, that means that the input price is high for packers, squeezing their margins. And so recognizing this dynamic, we really wanted to focus on long-term profitability in each sector, knowing that there is this dominoes where each one is interacting with the other. In general, producers are price takers, with cattle prices in Canada determined in the US market and then adjusted back for the exchange rate and basis. And basis is simply the transportation and transaction costs of getting beef from point A to point B. Therefore, profitability is often impacted by how producers control their cost of production. And Canada is a fairly small player in the global market, and therefore our competitiveness relative to other countries on cost of production is really important. And we know that in Canada, we also have, and we work within the cattle cycle. This is a 10 to 12 year cycle from peak to peak or trough to trough. And that's really driven by the biological lag of the animal from when the producer receives the price signal to expand to the time when that decision is made by the producer and when increased supply actually reaches the consumer can be 2 to 3 years later. And similarly, when the price signal says, this is enough supply, this is good, stay here, we actually have 2 to 3 years of additional increased production already in our pipeline. So because of our long production cycle, we typically have this cattle cycle that we work within for producers. And so this adds added complexity when we think about profitability for producers, and really requiring us to take a long-term perspective. So if we think of margins for any of these sectors being relatively steady over time on a per head basis, so they're not shrinking, but maybe they're not growing either, we have to remember that there are other costs that are increasing, specifically the cost of living for the producer. Everyone here in 2022 understands that inflation is a real thing that we're all experiencing over time. And that means that for a producer, if their margins are steady, you need to be continually expanding your herd in order to cover the owner's labor. And that is just to live and maintain the status quo. And this implies that to be economically sustainable, a beef production must not only be viable, but must be continually expanding and having the capital available to enable them to do that. Because if an operation is not profitable, there's not going to be enough financial capital to invest in expansion. So when we did this analysis, in 2016, back in 1990, you could support a family of 4 on a 200 herd operation, reaching the average income reported by Statistics Canada for Canadians. But by the time we got to 2000, 10 years later, you needed to have doubled your herd to 400 head. And by 2013, it had doubled again to about 800 head. And while we've seen prices increase for beef since 2013, we've also seen the price of input costs increase, which again puts us on that declining terms of trade and really squeezing producer margins. These are some of the criteria that came out for economic sustainability of producers in a report published in Australia. And many consider these hard-nosed and unrealistic as they're frequently not seen. And particularly in small and medium-sized agricultural operations. But as I noted, they are necessary because farming is capital intensive with both land and machinery. And it is possible for an operation to actually continue operating for a long time by eroding their equity. And it's really important for long-term sustainability of any operation, regardless of size, that they are maintaining and protecting their equity base. And so these are considerations that need to be addressed. And so things in here around paying owners a standard wage, unpaid labor on farms is a major thing that we need awareness of, but also recognizing that that's part of what makes these operations sustainable over the long term. So on the right-hand side, this is a study using 2020 data. There are 25 benchmark cow-calf farms across Canada. On the left, you see farms in BC, and on the far right, farms in the Maritimes. And this is cost of production. So the dark blue line is your cash costs, then you have your depreciation costs. And in order to continue operating in the medium term, you need to be able to replace assets as they depreciate. And then the light blue bar at the top is your opportunity costs. So as we indicated, unpaid labor, as well as opportunity costs to land. And in 2020, we had 84% of these farms covering their short-term or cash costs, and 72% of them were covering their medium-term costs. So that's cash and depreciation costs. And then we had 1/3, so 32% of the farms were covering cash, depreciation, and opportunity costs. And these statistics are fairly common in terms of family-owned small businesses. And cash flow is a major challenge for these businesses. But it's one of, when we think of the long-term sustainability of the sector, we want to be moving a greater proportion of those into being able to cover medium and long-term costs. Now, another thing I want to point out here is you see there's a lot of variation in these cost structures. And that's because they are operating in different physical environments. They also have different production systems. And being higher cost doesn't mean that they're not sustainable. It just means that they might be focused on marketing and having a higher price of premium product in order to sell, in order to cover those. But there'll be different strategies that producers use in order to be sustainable. So shifting now to look more on consumer resilience. And we've got to remember that demand is a consumer's willingness to pay for a specific quantity and quality of a product. In contrast, we have both short-term trends that are going to come and go. You can think of the Atkins diet and demand for high protein diets. That's a fad. But there's also these long-term trends in terms of fundamental changes in society that are going to play out over a long time. And as industry, we need to be able to distinguish between the fads and the trends to make sure that we're responding to the trends that are out there. And some of these trends are, increased population growth, as well as increased disposable income, which means we have a population globally that is wanting to consume more protein. And this is what's driving some of our food prices. But there's also other demographic considerations in terms of the culinary culture in each region, in terms of what types of products that they're looking for. And this is one of the reasons why we look for trade, which allows for those different culinary demands from around the world to maximize the value of a carcass on an animal, because different parts are going to be demanded in different markets. We also have medium-term perceptions. And so these are things that are influencing demand here right now and maybe in the next 2 to 3 years. And as Justin mentioned, we have this sustainable finance and the environmental considerations and sustainability considerations that are really showing up in these perceptions and wanting to be able to respond to those. And then we have short-term market impacts. And many consumers are price sensitive to changes in food, but we also have competition and substitutes within the protein category. So we may see switching between proteins as well as types of cuts over a short-term period as we see fluctuations in price. But overall, in terms of domestic demand, we've seen really strong domestic demand in Canada. Basically since 2014, it's been the strongest since the late 80s. And we have seen a very strong international demand. And this is partly due to the fact that demand with the population and income growth is growing faster than supplies right now. And one of the areas that a producer can respond to demand is in terms of quality. So quality grading in Canada, we want producers to be providing AAA and prime product. And we've seen producers over the years, as their price incentives, really increasing this over time. And on average, it's been about 2% per year. And that means that it's supporting a consumer's satisfactory eating experience every time they sit down to have a meal of beef. So we're almost at the end. Just wanted to think about sustainability and this concept of continuous improvement. Now, we do not expect profitability to improve continuously, but we do need to see producers and markets adapting to changing environments and consumer preferences so that we can be producing more of what the consumer wants and the attributes that they want and less of what they don't want. And in order to do that, I want to come back to the comment that Ann made and the challenges of the fact that we need to be able to link consumers and producers with a price signal. And so having that traceability of specific attributes that we can trace through the supply chain so that producers who are providing those attributes and the types of products that consumers are looking for and want more of, that they are actually getting that price signal to do that and are therefore seeing that economic and financial sustainability to their operation. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, JC.
Thanks, Brenna. I was really enjoying your presentation, and I'm a big data guru, so I love data. If I'm a beef producer and I'm trying to justify investing or not and shifting towards transitioning to a more sustainable business, are my margins going to be different, the same, except for I have environmental benefits compared to conventional?
So it's one that when we look at that, that's where having that price signal and connection is so important, because without that price signal, you've got producers with a variety of cost structures and a variety of profitability and margins. And yet you're unable to actually get that price signal to financially support the margins of the producers that are providing the things that you're looking for. And so there might be no distinction if there is no price signal that actually works to get back to the producer in an effective way.
I'm just trying to understand at the farm business level as a rancher, what is the top incentive to get them to adopt a more sustainable agriculture practice?
I would say the biggest incentive to adopt or not adopt something is, does it support their bottom line? Right. There are many who are in a financial position to do the right thing because they want to do the right thing and don't need the financial incentive. But if you're wanting to move everybody, then you need to consider the fact that financial incentives are important. There are a number of things that long-term producers will choose. So one of those is when you think of grazing management, and even the current drought that we're experiencing, producers are going to be looking at making the decision that may be painful short-term, but they know that grazing management now during a drought impacts their grazing and grass production long-term. And so they're going to be doing things to think about that long-term piece. And that's one of the things to remember when we talk about the cattle cycle and some of these other considerations. Cow-calf producers and the industry here are very long-term thinkers in terms of how is this impacting me down the road.
Absolutely. That was the topic of our third webinar. We did grassland value and land conversion, fantastic conservation. It's a good way to finish this session. I'm enjoying this. For Brenna, I'm going to switch over now to Argentina and we're moving from Canada to the Mercosur. So I'd like to invite Victor Tonelli from Argentina. He's a analyst in livestock and meats and very knowledgeable, passionate fellow. Hey, over to you, please, Victor.
Sí, ¿me están viendo?
Yes, can you hear me? Can you see me? Can you see me now?
Not yet.
A ver,
Parece
ahora
que tiene su cámara cerrada.
estoy intentando abrirla, ¿me escuchan?
I'm trying to activate my camera. We can hear you, but we cannot see you. I'm sorry, my signal is not good. In Buenos Aires, the internet signal is not good. Well, maybe what we can do is ask Gloria to share your presentation.
¿Ustedes me escuchan al menos?
Now, can you hear me at least? Yes, we can hear you. And Gloria will be the one presenting your slides. Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you very much. So I just wanted to make a few comments. First of all, I apologize, the interpreter cannot hear him. Oh, now he's back. So we would just like to mention that Mercosur today represents the area for beef production that is the most important nowadays. It is the main supplier for the largest volume markets, China, which is the one that has revolutionized the international demand. I apologize, he's cutting off. So today represents 75% of the supply for China and other markets. And aside from this, to understand Mercosur, you see the graph, the pie graph in front of you, a pie chart in front of you. We have Brazil, which represent over 65% of total production. Argentina has 25% approximately of the production, and then Paraguay and Uruguay in terms of volume. Now, regarding the markets, as I said, China for Mercosur defines the largest share of a market. China 5 years or 7 years ago was not as important for Mercosur. So it has generated a major revolution because of the type of products it receives and the way it receives it. You might also see some other important markets, the EU, Israel, the US, Middle East, etc. Gloria, can you please switch to the next slide? So I'm guessing you are seeing or you're watching a different levels of productivity linked to the number of cows and calves and the kilograms of carcasses for each country and the extraction rate over the whole herd. Are you seeing that? Just to make sure that I'm talking about the same thing? Yes, perfect. Yes, we're seeing it. So basically what I wanted to show you in this slide to talk about sustainability and reducing emissions and other things. What I wanted to show you is the low level in general of productivity that we have at Mercosur. Obviously, those are not visible, some conditions that we can see, As we see, Brazil is the country that has the largest number of animals in total production. But when you rate the Mercosur as a region, you see that it only represents 53.2% of calves. That is at the moment when it is taken away from its mom, that the average is 53%. That is a very low number or figure in terms of the potential for improvement that it may have if you were to compare it to other important countries when we think of beef production. So if you can see an improvement, a 10-point improvement, that would mean a significant improvement in the reduction of emissions on raw emissions on what is produced in the carcasses. Now, when we have the next figures, we have around 240 kilograms. This represents between 50 and 100 kilograms per slaughter animal compared to other countries around the world. So here we have a significant opportunity for improvement, which I insist will just depend on the reduction of emissions by kilo produced. And then in the extraction rate, if you were to compare the extraction rate, that is a number of animals that are killed yearly in Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina, we see that Paraguay still has an important opportunity to improve its extraction rate and also have an impact on all this. So can you switch to the next slide, please?
You are probably seeing, and I apologize if you don't, let me know if I am showing the right slide. You see a map where we can see the areas of deforestation, and which are especially challenging now from the buyers and great companies in many different regions, and of course where there's a great demand of consumers. Can you just confirm that we're looking at the right slide? Okay. So basically, if we leave aside other countries that may not belong to Mercosur, Peru, for example, but basically what you're seeing here is that there's a large part of Brazil with the Amazon region and also El Cerrado in Brazil, which is a new region, which is very complex because of the advance of deforestation for agricultural use, particularly for soybean. And this is very challenged by those that, of course, put into question everything that has to do with livestock production. So it's a complex area. And on the left, you can see the Bosque Chaqueño de Gran Chaco, which is a biome that has a part of Uruguay and part of Bolivia and part of Argentina. So these are the hot spots, I would say, and the areas that are of concern in the world. If we think about the UK, a country that for a year has been focusing on limiting or prohibiting certain practices within by countries that cannot prove that their end products come from fields that were not deforested or were not illegally deforested. Of course, this is an ongoing discussion, but that clearly indicates a threat. I know it's a strong word, but it is a threat for the future trade of those who are not in a condition to prove these more environmentally friendly practices. In November last year, in Europe, there are other actions along those lines, trying to indicate or impose different restrictions for products that cannot prove to be deforestation free or illegal deforestation free. and that engage in practices that protect the native forests. So I would like to make a few comments in this regard. Maybe in the next slide, we can follow point by point, and maybe I can start wrapping up my presentation. You are probably seeing a series of concepts that talk about sustainability challenges. If you can confirm this for me, I will continue. All right, then. I apologize, there are problems in the incoming audio. I apologize, there is no more incoming audio. I think we've lost Victor, I'm afraid. Yes, unfortunately, he has disconnected from the call.
Well, apologies, that happens. We work in 35 countries, and sometimes in rural settings, the connection isn't always fantastic. We do our best. I'm going to actually switch over to our next speaker then in this case, and we can ask a few questions to Victor if he joins back. But we really have an excellent speaker, John Trask. He's in CEO of Dimitra and Blockchain Guru in Calgary. And I see you, John. How are you? I think you have a mic off. Okay, good.
Very good. Thank you for having me here today.
A pleasure.
So I think I can maybe add some interest around the technology angle related to sustainability and beef. And I apologize up front if there's a bit of information about the company, but hopefully it'll give you some background as to what we're trying to do. Let me share my screen. Okay, so Dimitra is one of my corporations, and we look at applying technology to agriculture around the world. And I own another corporation, JC mentioned, Blockchain Guru. And from that corporation, we also look at how do we focus on blockchain and artificial intelligence to enable farmers and the food chain to advance their practices. Dimitra itself is ESG focused. We're really focused on how do we apply technologies and how do we enable farmers, and particularly in a lot of the world's smallholder farmers, to have access to technology for a reasonable price. You can think of what we've done as an operating system for ag tech. We do have a token that we use, and we're currently delivering our platform around the world to millions and millions of farmers working in Asia, South America, Africa for the most part. Landed a few contracts in the Middle East most recently. Prior to that, I spent a lot of time in tech consulting with large food chain companies in Canada and the US. So it's always interesting as a farm boy growing up on a farm and working on my family farm, how I can apply technology to help farmers and to help farming associations. And certainly I think technology plays a role from a reporting perspective relative to ESG. I'm going to play a little video in a minute. Our mission is really to get our platform out to as many smallholder farmers as possible. And some of what we have done is very focused on large farms and farming corporations. Some of what we've done is focused on smallholder farmers. I've got a very short video that hopefully you guys can hear the sound on. That will give you an overview of some of the things we do and what we're trying to do with technology.
The world has a problem. Millions of smallholder farmers barely produce enough to feed their families. Why? They lack modern solutions to monitor crops and livestock, the means to preserve and restore the land. And chemicals, deforestation, and climate change create new threats. Without help, small farms will struggle to survive. At Dimitra, our connected farmer platform delivers blockchain, machine learning, IoT, and satellite data to smallholder farmers worldwide, empowering each user with cutting-edge technology and services. We generate value across a new ecosystem, value in which we all share as farmers, Dimitra token holders, and members of a global community, where each user, regardless of economic status, has access to simple, beautiful, and life-changing technology to increase yield, reduce cost, and mitigate risk. Crop after crop, herd after herd, season after season, Dimitra improves the lives of farmers worldwide. The world
So we look at technology from two ways. One is farmer facing. What information can a farmer capture in order to manage their farm, to produce more crops, to manage more livestock? And then how does that fit together from a reporting perspective? What reports can we generate to help them, I guess, satisfy their sustainability reporting needs, their accounting needs, their business needs? And we try to tie all of that together. We're working in a number of countries. We've got many languages already on the platform. We're adding more and more languages to the platform. And from a connected farmer perspective, it's really around enabling people to use a mobile phone. Our platform is Android-based. We're building our iOS-based system. We're also web-based. And we have connected so many modules to this system. I think we're well over 50 modules. We have satellite reporting, we have IoT reporting, we have farmer observation reporting, integrations with health management for animals, and so many technologies. I won't go through them all. But the challenge is really, how do you get that information back? How do you help the farmer report on what they need to report on so that they can start capturing and getting some of the credits that they need so that they can manage exporting their produce or their beef, and so that they can comply from a regulatory perspective within their country. We don't focus on any one country. What we do as we enter a country is we build out customizations to manage the individual requirements of the farmers in that country. We have another very commercially focused product called Livestock Guru. Livestock Guru is about track and trace for individual livestock, managing all of those life cycle events, recording all of those life cycle events, managing and using AI and calculations to help with productivity and performance, using artificial intelligence and different feed management calculations in order to manage feed and help manage the cost associated with feed. And this goes as far as genomics and genetics so that we can integrate with livestock breeding management, looking at the entire genome of a cow and health issues associated with that. And we do all of this at a very low price per user. So when I look at technology and its relationship to sustainability, I look at it from a few different lenses. I look at the life cycle of the animal and how does a farmer record all of the events in the life cycle of an animal? And how do they produce a reliable record for export or for sustainability reporting or for whatever reason they might have? I look at feed management, I look at health management, genetics and genomics, data analytics and AI, and the climate impact of livestock and agriculture. So one of the things that we've done when we've evaluated technologies is we've looked at how do we record those technologies and how do we make sure that a record throughout the life cycle of an animal is reliable and that the provenance, the location, the date, the time, they all make sense, particularly in an export market where you're providing data to other countries. Some of the challenges are record keeping may not be 100% accurate. And with a phone, we can track where the record occurred, when the record was created, write that to a blockchain so it can never be changed. If a record needs to be replaced, we can record on the blockchain that the record has been replaced and when that occurred. Errors do happen, so there is a method for that. And then we look at all of those life cycle records from a quality, a health, a productivity perspective, genetic lineage, any certifications that may come up for a farmer, and any logistics related traceability. And we use our system in many, many areas of the world. And I built these systems not only for livestock, but across the food chain. So we look at data and how do we capture all of this data? And then what do we do with that data? You know, when we step out of livestock traceability, then we go into feed management. And the biggest factor for, one of the biggest factors for farmers is cost and quality and availability of feed. And how do you optimize feed? How do you minimize waste? How do you assure you're meeting your nutrient requirements? And then if we look at feed on a daily basis, what is that relationship to growth of an animal? And can we use artificial intelligence to evaluate feed from a productivity perspective? And we found some very interesting ways to do that. Can we evaluate not only the feed components from a climate perspective or emissions perspective, but balance those with cost and start trading information? And there's so much available information now with technology, and there's so many great pieces of software that can help ranchers and farmers manage their livestock and manage their crops. But we've got to take it to the next level and make more information available so that farmers can report their climate impact. They can report how cost effectively they're working and create a balance between all of these maybe competing factors. And then we look at herd health and starting with geolocation. And, you know, we've got some really interesting projects where we're measuring temperature and pH of animals and the rumen. We're starting to look at blood tests and vaccines and vaccine records and birth records and veterinary records. And part of our Livestock Guru platform enables us to provide this analysis. We can start using video in dairy barns and even pinch points within a ranch to start looking at the gait of cattle and understand if they may have lameness issues coming, using that video imagery to understand growth rates relative to feed rates and facial recognition when a dairy cow comes to a trough, in order to see that they're eating and and start providing better estimates of how much they're eating. Part of our platform now is genetics and genomics. And so we look at the entire genome and how the genome relates to risk of disease and productive and reproductive rates, and use that to help build a body of health records for the animal. And this can help us identify trends in the herd. And we have some countries who use our platform, so they use it on a national level, where they're managing, national breeding programs. And we can also have pop-ups come up that predict issues to avoid poor breeding decisions. The cost of this is greatly reducing as technology becomes more and more prevalent and more available. And a lot of the cost really to the farmer is more so in the time of capturing this than doing the analysis. So we can put the analysis right into the hands of farmers, typically through professional organizations. We're working with a large genetic research center in Africa that supports 4 countries there, and we're working in many areas of the world. But again, I want to bring back sustainability to technology, and how do we start combining some of these goals, and genetics and genomics is a core area of that. And once we've got all this data, what do we do with it? And we throw so many pieces of data into a data lake, and we've built dozens and dozens of machine learning algorithms that use artificial intelligence to pick out anomalies in the data. And there's key pieces of data in millions and millions of animals' life cycle data that gives us clues about how to manage different activities, from feed blending to illness prediction to genetic recommendations. And AI is becoming quite cheap, quite easy to deliver. It is a bit of a rocket science. It takes some time to put it together. We've got 150 great developers who are completely focused on using technology for agriculture and livestock management. And we come up with insights every day based on the data that we have available to us. So, I think as governments, as NGOs and not-for-profits, we have to start thinking about how do we take all of that data and create more benefit out of it. And then climate impact itself. Climate impact's interesting because every country we go to has different reporting requirements. What are the components of those reporting requirements, and how do we take farm-based data and provide it and package that in order for the farmer to maybe successfully apply for a grant, or at least have all of the information that they require. So we look at that from a data flexibility and a portability perspective. Once they get the data into the system, how do they get it out, and how do they use that? Can they use that for existing applications, for current applications, and how do they use that from a forecasting perspective? So, I just love to start the conversation and get people thinking about what data is important to them. I know you've probably all thought about that. How do you use that data once you get it? How do you get it is part of the problem. And then how does it help us solve our sustainability issues? So I know we all think about this quite a bit. From my perspective, that's my entire life, thinking about how we do that. And I'm going to wrap it up. JC, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks, John. Fascinating technology. What, in your experience, at least, I see you work in many developing countries. Have you had in terms of, I'm trying to understand the factors that influence the adoption of technology by small ranchers, because it's a big step. For some of them who are not familiar with the phone, moving the software. It's a lot of information. I'm not even sure they're thinking of data yet. They're like there are some initial stages there. What are the challenges that you've found so far?
I think that we always work with partners. We don't go and sell our application to individual farmers. So we don't, when we go work with a farming association or a national government or an NGO, we're typically looking at an individual group of farmers. Uganda, for example, has a cattle management platform, and they're really focused on achieving specific goals, increasing export revenue, managing herd health, managing compliance, and we always look at it and try to determine how do we incentivize a group of farmers to look at data and start using that to make themselves more productive, to increase their revenue, to maybe comply with export programs. So there's always a catalyst. And usually the catalyst is monetarily driven. In some cases, it may be harder to put an immediate value on it. Sometimes it's health compliance or from a reporting perspective, but still monetarily driven because they may not be able to export their beef if they don't meet certain standards. The adoption rate is incredibly quick. The world is looking at technology from a farming perspective, and I think there's hundreds, maybe thousands of companies building new software. We've spent tens of millions of dollars building our software to solve specific issues. I think that there are governing organizations as well, charitable organizations and banking organizations and world banks that are driving programs where maybe they're funding cattle initiatives or other agricultural initiatives, and they're looking to be able to report on the success of those initiatives. And what we find is many of them put in place the necessity that the farmer reports. But it does create a whole bunch of challenges around technology adoption and training. How many people do you need on the ground to train a farmer and answer questions and manage languages in Uganda and Saudi Arabia and India? And how do we do that as a small technology company in order to meet those needs? And so I'm always looking at how we incorporate different strategies in order to onboard more and more farmers. But there doesn't seem to be a shortage of farmers looking for tech.
Right, that's excellent. I'm thinking that the way that you're tailoring the language, culture, sector, very smart in terms of increasing that onboarding. And I wish we had more time to explore and understand that better. So many issues. That's fascinating. We're out of time, John. I wanted to thank everyone on YouTube, on Facebook for watching us. There are a lot more people there than on our Zoom platform today. So shout out to them. My thanks to the interpreters. My thanks to the logistics team here, ICA Canada, Gloria and Isabel. My thanks to IFAD for their financial support and partnership, Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, all the panelists. I very much enjoyed today's webinar. A reminder, this is the fourth of 5 webinars. Our last and 5th webinar will be on June 1st. We're going to look at development outcomes, of the United Nations. We're going to be looking at supply chain issues. And so there's lots more to come. Stay safe, and we'll see you in 3-4 weeks. Take good care, everyone. Cheers.